thanks so much for joining us today. That's a very good morning. Thank you for coming to our Field Crops Virtual Breakfast. I wanted to introduce our star today is Dr. Kurt Steinke. He is our Associate Professor in Soil Fertility and Nutrient Management. He is our guru in soil health and management. And today he's going to be talking about soil fertility. Start right to finish well. Kurt, with that, I will stop sharing and the floor, it's yours.
All right, thank you, Ricardo. Thank everybody for being online this morning. Some of you are probably dealing with some rain showers, some snow showers, and everything in between. And after we talk a little bit this morning, I'm sure Jeff will hit on some of that here in about 10 or 12 minutes. A couple things we wanted to go over today. This concept, this 5-word concept that we've talked about quite a bit over the last couple of years, start right to finish well. And so a lot of, what we're going to talk about here this morning deals with starter fertilizers, all right? We want to get plants off to as good of a start as we can, because obviously we don't know what lies ahead. The intolerance of uncertainty is something that's a little bit difficult to grasp. And if you look at what we've probably all been through over the last 12, 14 months, I think that rings true with regards to life and with regards to production agriculture. We don't tolerate what we don't know very well. And that's a little bit where the use of at-plant, pre-plant, and in some cases, early post-plant starter fertilizers can come into play. And so what we want to talk about a little bit here this morning is on usage, what is starter fertilizer, a little bit on when we should use it, and a little bit on why. And then I'll wrap up with a couple slides on other considerations this spring, one of them being soil temperatures. So I know we've talked a lot about maybe what a little bit different spring we've had thus far. I know Christy Sprague talked a little bit about growing degree days last week and how far we are ahead. When you look at soil temperatures, I had logged on, looked at a couple weather stations here the last couple of days. When you look at this year versus last year, a lot of our local stations around Lansing, we didn't cross 50 degrees Fahrenheit at our 2-inch soil temperature till about May 2nd or 3rd last year. And then it wasn't permanent until about May 15th, 16th. Remember, we had that Mother's Day frost or freeze thrown in. This year so far, we crossed that 50-degree soil temp threshold on about April 7th. All right. And we're probably hovering in about that 50 to 55 degree range right now with a little fluctuations with the cool pattern that we have yesterday and today. So I'll touch on that a little bit also. So what is starter fertilizer? One thing we have to remember is that starter is a practice, not a product. All right. So there's certain products that we tend to use a little more often for starter fertilizer, but in the end, it is a practice, not a specific product. And what it is, it's nothing more than typically fertilizer placed in close proximity to the seed at planting time. There's multiple methods to do this. You can look at in furrow, you can look at subsurface banded, you can look at deep banding, etc. What tends to be the most consistent year in and year out tends to be that 2x2. And I don't care if you're maybe in a 1x2, 1x3, 2x3, etc. Each grower has their own method of doing things. But that 2x2 band tends to be pretty consistent. And why do we use starter fertilizer? To give those roots early access to plant nutrients. Not necessarily to hasten emergence, all right? We don't necessarily emerge or break through that soil any quicker with starter, but we tend to hasten plant growth. And there's multiple primary reasons for using starter fertilizer. The first is probably the most common is to stimulate early plant growth, right? And because you stimulate that early plant growth, you get that plant off to a good start, but you may or may not increase grain yield. You can look at that picture I have on the right there. That was taken a couple years back, looking at corn on the left that had a little bit of 2x2 at planting time. And this tremendous difference, you can see about 3 or 4 additional leaf collars with that plant on the left versus the one on the right. In the end, we did not have a grain yield difference in that specific instance. Another reason might be to improve uniformity Right through that field, we have a lot of soil variability here in Michigan, a little bit more than some of our surrounding states, and it can help make that plant stand a little bit more uniform after emergence. Obviously, the third one there might be a little bit to increase yield. That depends on which specific nutrient we're talking about. One that we don't talk about too much is Starter offers a little bit greater flexibility for side dressing corn. I'll hit on that here a little bit. It's a great opportunity to apply some micronutrients if they are needed. It's a great opportunity to improve your nutrient efficiency, specifically with regards to phosphorus fertilizer. And that last one there, that start right capacity to capitalize on mid-season environmental conditions. And so when we talk about start right to finish well, it's going to vary from year to year. Here's a picture on the left. You can see about 40 units of N in a 2x2 with a V4 side dress. On the right, about 175 units of N at a V4 side dress. And we saw about a 15 bushel difference in this specific season with that starter fertilizer on the left. So again, it's going to depend a little bit on those mid-season environmental conditions that we tend to encounter, which can fluctuate quite a bit. Where do we see the greatest benefit of starter fertilizer? All right, the greatest benefit tends to be our low STP, or low soil test phosphorus soils. So that would be for corn and soybean below 15 ppm Bray or less than 20 ppm Malic. And in some cases, our low STK soils. In those cases, it might depend on how low we are. That would be about less than 100 ppm on sands or less than 120 ppm on your fine textured soils, and that would be in Malic. And why? Why do we see a benefit on those low testing soils? Well, we know phosphorus and potassium diffuse very slowly to the plant. All right. And when you talk about how nutrients get to a plant root, there's multiple methods. But when you talk about diffusion, you go from a zone of high concentration to a zone of low concentration. All right. And what this banding, what the starter fertilizer does is it actually artificially creates a concentration gradient. So you create a concentration gradient from high to low, high being that starter band, low being where that plant root is emerging, and those nutrients can diffuse from that high to low area. Cool soils, we often tend to see somewhat of a benefit to starter fertilizer also. And why? We tend to get a little bit slower root growth in cool soils, and we tend to get less water movement, right? So if there's less heat accumulated in the soil, we tend to get less water movement, less transpiration, less ET, etc. Less water movement means you're going to get less nutrient movement to those emerging plant roots. We talked a little bit here about diffusion distances. I always bring this up in class when I teach in the fall. You know, how far do nutrients move? So I'm going to focus here on phosphate and potassium here a little bit. When you start talking about how much they might move within a given growing season, phosphorus maybe about 0.02 centimeters. All right. 0.02 centimeters, and on a per day basis, about 0.004 centimeters, right? This might not mean much, but when you start looking at this bottom line here, that the mean distance between corn roots in the top 15 centimeters or so of soil is about 0.7 centimeters. So nutrients may have to diffuse up to about 0.35 centimeters to reach a root. All right, 0.35, you start looking at 0.004 with regards to per day with phosphorus. You can do the math. Some regards, that's a very long distance that those nutrients may have to go. And some of those nutrients, specifically phosphorus, can't move very far or quickly. One thing you want to be aware of when you use starter fertilizer is you don't want to create a nutrient deficiency. So I got a kick out of this picture. We took this back in June of 19. That plant you see on the left got 40 units of N in a 2x2, and that plant on the right did not get starter fertilizer. Take a look at those red arrows. What are they pointing at there? You're looking at a phosphorus deficiency. All right. Why did we, or how did we create that phosphorus deficiency? Well, the soil test phosphorus in this field was getting very close to critical. So it wasn't below critical, but it was about 20 ppm Bray P1. And so what happened was the lower you get or the closer you get to critical, the more you tend to fix some of those nutrients, specifically phosphorus and potassium. What happened here? We created the slug of growth. fast growth with that starter fertilizer, and it just could not uptake phosphorus quick enough, and we artificially created a phosphorus deficiency in that picture on the left. Did it grow out of it? Absolutely. By about V7, V8 corn, you could not tell that there was a P deficiency, but again, it's something to be aware of in case you see something like that develop in the field. What about high P and K soils? We get that question quite a bit. Should you use starter fertilizer on your high P and K testing soils? Well, that depends. A biomass response is probably quite likely. All right. Yield response, the probability is quite low. All right. A couple of other benefits outside of yield, however, we can see decreased grain moisture at harvest time when we use starter fertilizer in our high P and K soils. We can also hasten maturity or development. All right, by maybe anywhere from about 6 or 7 to 10 days. All right, so your improved return on investment may come a little bit more from your reduced drying costs, if they are there, rather than that increased yield. A couple of other scenarios I'm going to go over here this morning, other than low nutrients, where starter fertilizers may pay would be early planting. All right, we've seen a lot of that this season so far. So if you're looking at early planting and your soil test phosphorus levels are between about 15 and 30 parts per million, you can look at this table over on the right. When you look at your 2-inch soil temperature with early planting and the response, the yield response to phosphorus application, that probability. You know, right now, a lot of us are probably in about this 50 to 55 degree range with our 2-inch soil temperatures, which still is that moderate to high scenario with regards to seeing a yield response when you have soil test phosphorus in this 15 to 30 part per million range. As this gets closer to 60, that yield response probability tends to drop fairly quickly. A couple other scenarios where they might pay: late side dress. All right, if you automatically plan on side dressing corn after V6, starter might help you get to that V6 side dress timing or later. You know, a lot of us are going a little bit later, maybe the late vegetative, closer to R1. Key is you want to get that plant to that side dress timing. The later you go after V6, the more starter N you'll probably need to avoid that seedling end stress. And the other thing to remember is if you're corn after corn or corn after wheat, those scenarios tend to show a greater benefit to starter N specifically. Two other scenarios, perhaps no-till, where you got a little heavier residue, would be something to consider, and those irrigated or high yield environments would also be something to consider. And over here in the bottom right, you can see usually a lot of our starter programs will be anywhere between about 20 and 40 units of N, about 10 to 20 units of P2O5, and probably a little bit of sulfur. Want to wrap up here quick. Got a lot of questions on this so far when you start looking at our suggested N rates for corn for 2021. There's a lot of questions out there on fertilizer prices, right? The key is I punched some numbers earlier yesterday. When you look at pricing from about 2 days ago, about 570 bushel corn. And right now, depending on where you're at, it's about 55 cents a pound. Sure enough, that ratio is about 0.10. All right. So we're concerned a little bit about that uptick in fertilizer prices, but corn prices have gone up a little bit too. All right. So that ratio is about 0.10. So when you start looking at suggested N rates, again, that 0.10 may optimize your investment. And I always put this red circle up there. If you're not concerned about your ROI and just want high yield, go with the 0.05 price ratio that you see over here on the left. And those scenarios tend to be non-limiting. Last thing this morning, know your differences between corn and soybeans. So often we tend to treat them the same. Couple things to remember with corn. Remember, we get a lot of nutrient uptake prior to R1. Specifically with nitrogen, we get about 70% of our N uptake by R1. A little bit different when you start looking at soybean. Remember, soybeans put on biomass pretty uniformly as that season goes on, and that nutrient uptake tends to match that biomass production. For instance, we get about 20% of our N uptake by R1 in soybeans, and about 50% of our K uptake occurs in that short window between R1 to R4. All right. So again, soybean and corn, very different in how they uptake a lot of our micro and macronutrients. Pay attention and know those differences. So I will wrap up there for this morning. We'll hand it over to Jeff. I will stick on a little bit after this morning if there are any questions.
Kurt, I have one question here that came up earlier today. It's from Hannah, a neighbor in Ohio. She said, we have a program called H20, and we can't apply phosphorus or potassium for 4 years if we go with that plan. How can we do recommendations?
Yep, that's a great question. So a lot of those programs are most likely put in place in critically impaired watersheds. So in a lot of those scenarios, your soil test phosphorus and soil test potassium levels are probably in that high or excessively high category to begin with in many instances. So in those instances, like I said earlier this morning, even typically the application of Starter P or Starter K typically will not have a grain yield response. So obviously nothing is 100% guaranteed all the time, but the probability drops drastically when you're in those high and excessively high ranges. So it's not necessarily an issue. We've done a lot of discussions, over the winter on especially soil test phosphorus concentrations and where they should or should not be, especially with the revision of the tri-state recs right now. So that's something to remember. You don't want to build up either those soil test phosphorus, soil test K levels to those high or excessively high zones or categories because they do become a little bit more of an environmental risk. And then obviously from an agronomic and nutrient use perspective, isn't necessarily the best return on investment either.
Kurt, and you talk a lot about starter, and so I think you covered that part. But if you can just go back, so we are talking about what's the recommendation if you are doing a split application. You go with a starter, and so whenever I go back again for corn, if you need to make like a one size fit all recommendation, what's like the basic recommendation out there?
Yep, great question. So, there's probably 11, 12,000 corn growers in the state, and they're going to do nutrient management 11 or 12,000 different ways, right? Depending on infrastructure, depending on rotation, depending on soil test concentration levels, et cetera. So, typically if you go with starter, you probably want to minimize your PrePlant End. And then in that starter, typically 20 to 40 units of N is a solid mark to shoot for. Now that number will deviate and fluctuate a little bit depending on when you want to side dress, right? So if you are going to side dress in probably that V4 to V6 window, you can usually get away with about, again, that 20 to 40 pounds of N. We tend to go a little bit closer to 40. I know as you go further south in the state and down in Indiana, they tend to, I think, typically go a little bit less than that. But now, if you want to side dress a little later, all right, let's say automatically you might want to be in that V8 to V10 or maybe even a little bit later than that. That's where you really got to do some experimentation probably on the farm. What we found when we move past that V4 to V6 window, usually closer to about 60 units of N in a 2x2 tends to get you to that side dress application timing. Now it'll vary a little bit on weather conditions, right? If June is bone dry and we get, quarter inch of rain or half inch of rain the whole month, that's a different scenario. If we get 8 inches of rain in June, like we did probably, I think 4 years ago or so, we got about 8 inches over 3 days. That's a different scenario. So you got to be a little bit fluid with what you choose. But if you go past that V4 to V6 window, typically closer to about 60 units gets us to that side dress application timing. So the key thing to remember is whatever you choose, you want to make sure you give that plant enough gas to get to your side dress application time, whether it's V4, V6, V8, or even later. Typically about 40 units has done a good job on our fine textured soils. I'm going to probably group those in about CECs of about 9 or 10 and higher. 40 units has done a good job getting to that V4 to V6, and about 60 units gets us to about that V8 to V10 range.
Perfect. Kurt, and actually now I'm going to have a follow-up on that because it's all about taking risks. So, and I don't know if you can answer that, but so I always wonder, okay, if you are doing a full application and you're laying 200 units at the beginning and corn start to pick it up 30 days after planting or so, and that nitrogen is there for 30 days. So the question is, what is more dangerous? Me having that extra nitrogen there that can leach or go to another place, not to the crop, or maybe go to a starter and maybe a late application, and I might not have the right time to go because we got some rain. So it's all about taking risks, right? So, but in your environment, what's your recommendation?
I want to say that depends, right?
We always love that, right?
So there's risk in everything. So pre-plant end, isn't necessarily a bad practice, right? I think it tends to get a little bit of a bad rap. Now, the thing we got to consider here is when you look at our soils in Michigan, we tend to be a lot more variable, okay, across a given field than many of our surrounding states. We tend to have a little bit more variation in soil depth. We tend to not have as deep of a soil profile across a good chunk of the state as compared to maybe some of the I states, especially when you start looking at maybe Illinois, where you got a solid maybe 6-foot mollisol, something like that. And so, the pre-plant end can work. But again, it's going to depend on those weather conditions. So if it's dry, you might get poor use of your pre-plant end. If it's wet, yes, you could leach a little on those coarse textured soils, or you might denitrify a little on those fine textured soils. So again, risk is something that I think, farming is one of the more risky operations that we have for an occupation in this country for a number of reasons. The thing we got to remember is we can't get stuck in this cookbook recipe that this is what I'm going to do and I'm not going to adjust, right? So even if you look at like the MRTN approach to corn and overall rates, that is a pre-plant or pre-season end recommendation. All right, that gives you a good ballpark figure to start off with. If you start with that, and again, we get 8 inches of rain in June, I'm pretty sure most of us are going to adjust, right? You're probably going to adjust your end practices, and you're probably going to adjust your yield potential. But one of the key things I've learned over the years, and I always suggest to people is, do you know more 40 days into the growing season, or do you know more at planting or pre-plant? And typically the answer is, a little bit more 30 to 40 days into the growing season. And so that's where that whole idea of give that plant some nutrients in starter to get it going. And then when you get about 30 to 40 days after planting, you kind of have a good general trend at what this summer may look like at that point in time, whether it's wet, dry, hot, cold, etc. And then you can adjust either your end rate, adjust either maybe your side dress timing, or in essence, even adjusting your overall yield potential based on how that growing season looks.
Awesome. John, actually, he asked a question saying, any opinion on using 2x2x2 starter?
Yep. So I get a lot of questions on 2x2x2. And, it's funny. When I started here, 11 or 12 years ago now, 2x2 infrastructure was getting ripped off planters. And then, we start to see the benefits, as that climate variability has increased over the last decade or so, we start to see these benefits again of starter fertilizer and those 2x2 infrastructure going back on planters. And now it's switching to 2x2x2. Could there be something to it? I don't know. My guess is there probably isn't. The thing is, if a plant takes up, if you 2x2 on the right side of a plant, that end that gets taken up gets shared with that whole plant, right? It doesn't just take it up on one side of the plant, etc. And so, does that 2x2x2 pay off? Possibly, it could. Do I expect it to? I think the probability is probably low, but there might be instances where it could.
Thank you, Kurt. Mike asks us, what is a good starter fertilizer for soybeans in 2x2?
That's also a great question. So when you start talking about starter fertilizer on soybeans, It gets a little bit more ambiguous, right? First question to ask yourself is, what are your soil test concentrations, right? What are your P levels? What are your K levels? And if your K levels aren't deficient, you probably go without that K in that starter. Then we start looking at N and P and maybe a little bit of S. Things to think about. Typically, we try to keep our starter on soybeans at about 20 units of N and under. And the question as to why is because usually when we get past about that 20 pounds of N as starter on soybeans, we tend to see a decrease in nodulation, right? So you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? And so it doesn't make any sense to apply higher if you're just going to cut back on your nodulation. Then it gets into if you can cap it at about 20 units of N or so, what goes along with it, perhaps a little phosphorus, a little sulfur, etc. We haven't seen great sulfur responses on soybeans. We've seen much better sulfur responses on your more N responsive crops, those being something like corn, sugar beets, wheat also. And so in those high yield potential areas, and what defines that, typically probably a good rule of thumb would be about 70 bushels or higher. We've seen some benefit to starter from a production standpoint, from a yield perspective, especially if you're in that irrigated sector. So if you can get to 70 bushels and higher, we've seen some impact of starter. The thing you have to watch, though, is many times, and we saw this last year, that white mold issue. So even on 30-inch rows, when we use starter, we had row closure earlier than drilled beans, and we got pretty significant amount of white mold that wiped out about 20 to 25 bushels to the acre. So if I look at last year, we probably had in some treatments about 95 bushel beans. And with our white mold incidents, those dropped down to about 72 to 75 bushel. So again, a little bit is good, a little bit more is not necessarily better. So can we see a benefit of starter on soybeans? Occasionally, yes. Take a look at those soil test concentrations, specifically with regards to P and K, and then watch how much N you put down.
And Kurt, I want to follow back. I have a question, and I want to see your thoughts on those. Nitrogen inhibitors for us here in the state. What's your thoughts to use? What do you think?
Yep, great question. So, we talked a little bit about N inhibitors, this winter at a couple meetings. So there's two different sectors, right? You got your urease inhibitors and you have your nitrification inhibitors, right? Two different things. Do not group those two chemistries together. So when you start talking about urease inhibitors, those are aimed at surface applications of nitrogen. All right. So if you're not applying your N on the surface, the likelihood of seeing a response to a urease inhibitor is quite low, if perhaps non-existent. So those are intended for surface applied N. Now, we're not talking about surface applied N that you then incorporate. All right. We're talking about N that stays on the surface. That's where you want to aim your urease inhibitors at. So in those scenarios, that surface N application, maybe no-till, heavy residue, etc., that is where you want to aim those urease inhibitors. And there's a number of different chemistries out there. Some work a little better than others. Make sure you look at the label. So one of the more famous ingredients, you look at NBPT. There's different quantities of NBPT in different products. So just because you see something like NBPT on the label, don't assume that they're all the same. All right, you might have 2% NBPT, you might have 10, you might have 15, 20% NBPT. All right, so that's the first thing to look at. Nitrification inhibitors are a little bit different story. So those tend to keep nitrogen in that ammonium form for a longer period of time and keep it from transforming to nitrate. So where you want to focus those are on either high leaching potential soils or where you have high zones of denitrification. All right, so if you're perhaps in a well-tiled situation or you're pretty aggressive with your tile, maybe you're on 15 to 20 foot centers for your strings of tile, and you're not going to have a lot of standing water, denitrification may not be that large of an issue. You may not want to use something like a nitrification inhibitor. On those areas where you might leach a little bit more N downwards, so that's the downward movement of nitrate through that soil profile, those are where you might want to focus that nitrification inhibitor. But you got to remember on these sandy, coarse textured soils, so where you have low CECs, I'm thinking here probably about 5 and under, there's only so much cation binding ability. So you can keep N in that ammonium form, but you might not have anywhere for it to hang on to in that soil profile because it's a coarse textured soil. And many of the nitrification inhibitors may not be labeled on some of these crops that are grown on some of these coarse textured soils. So that would be another thing to consider. So when you start talking about urease inhibitors and nitrification inhibitors, they can work. There's probably certain scenarios where you want to focus them, like I talked about, those denitrification, those leaching zones, or that surface applied N.
All right, Kurt. So that is amazing, because a lot of times I talk to folks and they do that as like it is in the package. Do you know what I mean? So let's do it, and I always ask myself, should I? Do you know what I mean? And now you answer that, because it's not always the case, right? To go with that.
Yep, and you know, we talked a little bit about risk. Oftentimes, with something like even urease inhibitors, you know, those are focused on surface applied N. There can be risk to using a urease inhibitor, and what we've noticed from time to time, if you use a urease inhibitor and you get a large rainfall, probably within about 3 days, and large, I'm talking probably an inch and a quarter or greater, we tend to lose a little bit more N. So you got to remember, when you start talking about something like urea is a non-charged molecule. What that urease inhibitor can do is it keeps it in that non-charged state for a longer period of time. So if you surface apply your N with a urease inhibitor and do get one of these larger rains, you might move that N deeper in that soil profile. And depending on where you are with your crop growth stage, you might move it out of that rooting zone for a period of time. So there can be risk factors to some of these products. So just be aware of some of that risks that can go with some of these products.
Awesome. I do have a follow-up with the 820 question. Since we are limited the application of fertilizer, would we be looking at low levels of P and K after 4 years? Since we would go in down a period, since we aren't maintaining the P and the phosphorus and I assume K levels. Yeah. I'm going to read one more time. So follow up with the 820 question. Since we are limited the application of fertilizer, would we be looking at low levels of P and K after 4 years? Since we would go in down period, since we are maintaining the P and K levels? That's the question. Do you see that in the chat box?
Yeah. So I think the question is, would we be looking at low levels of P and K after 4 years? All right. And the answer to that is depends what you start off at, right? So if you're excessively high, you probably do want to draw those down. And where do you want to draw those down to? So you start looking at your soil test phosphorus levels. Again, you want to keep them from a Bray P1 perspective in that 15 to 30 range. From a Malic 3 perspective, you want to keep it in that 20 to 40 parts per million range. With potassium, we're not deficient until we're below 100 on your sandy coarse textured soils. We're not deficient till we're below 120. So it depends what you start off at. You know, it's impossible to know right now, but you can pencil out based on where you start off at. Look at your 4-year crop rotation. You can look at crop removal over the next 4 years. And as long as you stay within that realm of crop removal, you can kind of have an idea of where you should be after 4 years if you don't apply P and K. Now, if you drop into maybe that maintenance zone, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Our philosophy is always you probably want to stay in the middle to the high end of that maintenance zone, because the closer you get to critical, the more likely you are to fix both P and K. All right. So again, you know, it's a little bit of an ambiguous answer, but it depends on what you start off at. Okay. So if you're looking at a Bray P1 of 200 parts per million or greater, all right, you probably should draw that down and you shouldn't apply phosphorus, all right, until you bring that down into more an agronomic, sustainable level. But it's impossible to know, and it's impossible to give a blanket answer because everyone's soil test phos and potassium concentration is going to differ.
Kurt, thanks so much. Kurt, Are you able to give me your 2 cents on furrow biologicals? In furrow biologicals, do you have anything to tell us about it?
Oh, I think there's a lot to tell about in-furrow biologicals, right? And we're probably running out of time to talk about that. So we've looked at biologicals, a number of products, number of years, number of factors. I know Marty Chilvers in plant pathology has looked at quite a bit of biologicals also. Biofertilizers, it's another key buzzword out there. We start looking at specific fertilizer products that are inoculated with specific organisms. At the end of the day, the thing to remember is soil microbes are going to vary by soil texture. They're going to vary by rotation. They're going to vary within a field. They're going to vary within a soil bed, right? Within a specific soil particle. Things like pH are going to impact the biology of the soil. And so, we have to take some of this with a grain of salt, that if you have a product that might have anywhere from 1, 2, or 3 dozen different microbes in it, the thing we have to remember is, do those microbes belong in this specific field? A great analogy here would be if I had a Ziploc bag and I put 5 pills into it that are going to make you healthier, and that person says no, then I go to the next person online today and said, well, these same 5 pills are going to make you healthier. So again, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to that. With a lot of the DNA sequencing out there, we're finding out a lot more about which organisms function well in specific environments. But we're also finding out that the environment dictates a lot of who is or who is not there. Is it moist? Is it dry? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is your pH acidic? Is it basic? Is it neutral? Those will also all influence the microbial activity. And the other thing you got to think about is, with the biological that you are applying, doesn't even belong in that field. Is it native to that field? That's a question that really few people ask. Or are you introducing a foreign organism into a field? That's something that probably a lot of us will start looking into as we go into the next several years.
Oh man, so I love this topic. So actually, Phil just came up with a follow-up question, and I think that's a nice one to ask as well. Do the soil biology that's already in the soil overwhelm what's added?
That's a great question. I don't know if we can specifically answer that question. So you start talking about some of these biologicals and whatnot, and I think from a plant pathology standpoint, there's a lot of work and positive work that can be done when you start trying to look at maybe practices that can reduce the population of maybe specific soil-borne pathogens, things like that. Can it overwhelm what is already there? I think that's going to depend. So we're doing a lot of work. We have a big federally funded national potato soil health project across 10 states where we're looking at this specific thing, looking at different organic amendments, looking at things like fumigation, looking at things like continuous cover cropping in conjunction with cash cropping, and trying to find out after about 3 or 4 years what happens to that population that we started off at. So a lot of this work is not short-term work. We're not looking at 1-2 year trials. We're looking at 5-10 year trials minimum.
Kurt, man, it was amazing your talk today. Thank you so much for everything you do for us here. We very much appreciate you. Thanks so much. We are running out of time. We talk a lot here. It's great. I just wanted to plug in something very quick here. We have our Mission Soybean on Farm research projects for 2021. I know we have 86 folks here today, and we are looking for partners. If you wanted to learn about some of these projects that you wanted to have in your farm, you want to help us, and also to answer your own questions, please contact me or Mike Staton, and we can talk to you guys. We have like a bunch of projects, all very easy to go through. So if you wanted to partner with us, please make sure to contact Mike Staton or either myself or your educator in your area. Mike, do you have anything to add?
No, Ricardo, I think you covered it really well. The only thing I would add is that we did test a biological product last year as one of our on-farm strip trials, and we're looking at it again this year as an in-furrow product. And we actually showed a nice increase in 2 locations, 1.6 bushels per acre in 2 locations. The rest of the locations were kind of flat and did not perform as well, but 2 of the, I think it was 8 locations, really did shine. So we are looking at that product again this year.
Right, yeah, so that's a very good plugin. So if you want to help Kurt to answer those questions, you might have your own little project in your backyard. So if you want to partner with us, that's a good way to go. With that, Phil, do you have anything to add, sir?
Just one comment. Thank you so much, Kurt. That was terrific today. You did an excellent job of explaining a lot of things that people have on their mind. And Jeff, thanks for the good news, I think, that our spring is being delayed a little bit. And with that, I think we're all set, Ricardo.
All
Done
right.
for the day.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys so much, and stay safe, and I see you all next week. Bye-bye.